There are nights in television history that aren't recorded in Emmy logs or Nielsen ratings. Nights that didn't make headlines. Nights where something happened that mattered more than entertainment ever could. This is about one of those nights. It's 1977, Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, 30 million people watching, band playing, audience laughing, everything running like it always does, smooth, professional, timed to the second. But tonight, something breaks. Not the cameras, not the lights, something else. And when it does, Johnny Carson makes a choice that stops being about television and becomes about something older, something quieter, something that reminds people why they let this man into their living rooms every single night for 30 years. Let's go back. It's a Tuesday, March 15th, 1977. The show that night is typical Carson. Monologue about President Carter. A sketch with Ed McMahon. Scheduled guests include a comedian doing 5 minutes and an actress promoting a film nobody will remember. Standard late-night rhythm. Nothing unusual planned. During the second commercial break, right after the monologue, right before the desk segment, a production assistant approaches Johnny backstage. She's holding a piece of paper, not a cue card, not a sponsor note, a letter. It arrived that afternoon by regular mail, forwarded from NBC's main office, handwritten, 3 pages. The return address is from a hospice facility in Cleveland, Ohio. Johnny takes it, scans the first few lines. His face changes. The PA says later she saw him read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked back out for the next segment. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for a rewrite, just kept it. But something shifted. The letter was from a nurse named Patricia Henley. She worked night shifts at St. Augustine's Hospice on the east side of Cleveland. She wrote the letter on behalf of a patient, a woman in her final days, a woman who had one last request. Her name was Eleanor Hartman. Eleanor was 71 years old in the spring of 1977. She had been admitted to hospice care 3 weeks earlier. Stage 4 cancer. No treatment options left. The doctors gave her days, maybe 2 weeks if she stayed comfortable. She had 4 children, all grown, all visited when they could. She had 11 grandchildren. She had worked as a house cleaner for 43 years. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Hartman, died in 1952 during the Korean War. She raised those 4 children on her own. She never remarried. She worked 6 days a week for most of her adult life. She took the bus. She brought her lunch in a paper bag. She saved enough to send 2 of her kids to community college. She attended church every Sunday until her body wouldn't let her anymore. And every single night for over 20 years, she watched The Tonight Show. Not because she loved celebrities, not because she cared about Hollywood. She watched because of Johnny. Her daughter, Margaret, said later in an interview that her mother had a ritual. Didn't matter how tired she was. Didn't matter if she had to be up at 5 in the morning. At 11:30 p.m., she sat in her chair, turned on the television, and watched Johnny Carson. Margaret said, it was the 1 hour of the day she smiled. Eleanor didn't talk much about her life, didn't complain, didn't talk about how hard it was to lose Thomas. Didn't talk about the double shifts or the aching knees or the years of loneliness. She just kept going. But she talked about Johnny. She'd tell her kids, he's a good man, you can tell. She'd laugh at his jokes. She'd smile when Ed laughed. She'd say goodnight to the screen when Johnny signed off. It wasn't parasocial in the modern sense. It wasn't obsession. It was companionship. For a woman who spent her days cleaning other people's houses and her nights alone in a small apartment, Johnny Carson was the one constant. The one friend who showed up. Every night. On time. No matter what. When Eleanor was admitted to hospice, she stopped talking much. The pain medication made her tired. The cancer had spread to her bones, her lungs, her liver. She drifted in and out. But at 11:30 p.m., she opened her eyes. The nurses noticed. Patty Henley noticed. Eleanor would wake up right before the monologue. She wouldn't speak. But she'd watch. Even when she couldn't lift her head, even when her breathing was labored, she watched. One night, about 4 days before she passed, Patty was checking Eleanor's vitals during the commercial break. Eleanor reached out and touched her hand. Patty stopped. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. She said, "Can you do something for me?" Patty leaned in close. "Of course, anything." Eleanor said, "Can you tell Johnny I said thank you?" Patty didn't understand at first. Tell who? Eleanor's eyes moved toward the television. Johnny was back on screen, introducing the next guest. Johnny, she said. Tell him he stayed. Patty felt something crack open in her chest. She asked, What do you want me to tell him? Eleanor closed her eyes. Her voice was so quiet, Patty almost didn't hear it. Just say my name, Eleanor. That's all. Just so he knows. Patty Henley had been a hospice nurse for 9 years. She'd sat with hundreds of patients in their final days. She'd heard last requests. Some wanted to see family. Some wanted a priest. Some wanted a song. Some wanted silence. But this was different. This woman, who had no money, no fame, no platform, wanted Johnny Carson to say her name. Not as a bit, not as a segment, just as acknowledgement, just so someone out there knew she existed. Patty went home that night and wrote the letter. She didn't expect a response. She didn't know if it would even reach him. She just knew she had to try. She wrote about Eleanor, about Thomas, about the 4 kids raised alone, about the 43 years of cleaning houses, about the empty apartment and the 1 hour each night where Eleanor wasn't alone. She wrote, Eleanor doesn't have much time. She's been a faithful viewer for over 20 years. She never missed a night. She doesn't want anything except to hear you say her name. Just once. She said you feel like the only friend who stayed. Patty mailed it on March 12th. She didn't tell Eleanor. She didn't want to promise something that might not happen. 3 days later, Johnny Carson held that letter in his hands during a commercial break in Burbank, California. The show continues. Johnny does the desk segment. He banters with Ed. He interviews the comedian. He introduces the actress. Everything runs on schedule. The audience laughs in all the right places. But people who worked on the show that night said something was different. Johnny seemed distracted. Not unprofessional, not off, just somewhere else. He kept touching his jacket pocket. Toward the end of the show, after the last commercial break, Johnny does what he always does. He thanks the guests, he thanks the band, he does the usual good nights. But then he doesn't stand up. He stays seated at the desk. The audience starts to clap, ready for the closing theme. But Johnny raises one hand, just slightly, and they stop. Doc Severinsen, the band leader, sees it. He signals the band to hold. The studio goes quiet. Johnny looks directly into the camera. Not at the audience, at the camera, at the lens, at the 30 million people on the other side. He doesn't smile. He says, before we go tonight, I want to do something a little different. Ed McMahon glances over. He doesn't know what's happening. This isn't in the script. Johnny reaches into his pocket and pulls out the letter. He unfolds it slowly. He doesn't read from it. He just holds it. He says, I got a letter today from a nurse in Cleveland, Ohio. She wrote to me about one of her patients, a woman named Eleanor. The audience is completely still. Johnny continues. Eleanor is 71 years old. She's in hospice care. She doesn't have much time left. And this nurse, her name is Patty, she wrote to tell me that Eleanor has watched this show every night for over 20 years. Johnny pauses. His voice is steady, but something in it has changed. It's softer, more careful. Eleanor lost her husband in Korea in 1952. She raised 4 kids on her own. She worked as a house cleaner for 43 years. She never remarried. She never stopped working. And every night, at 11:30, she watched this show. He looks down at the letter, then back up at the camera. Patty says Eleanor's dying wish, the one thing she wanted, was for me to say her name. Just once. Just so she'd know that someone out there knew she existed. The studio is silent. Not the polite silence of a serious moment in a talk show. The real silence, the kind that happens when entertainment stops and something human takes over. Johnny sets the letter down on the desk. He looks directly into the camera. He says, Eleanor Hartman, this one's for you. And then he smiles. Not the Carson smile, not the performer smile, a real one. Small, quiet, the kind of smile you give someone when words aren't enough. He holds it for 3 seconds. Then he says, good night, folks. The theme music starts. The camera pulls back, the credits roll. Johnny doesn't stand up right away. He just sits there, looking at the letter on his desk. The next morning, NBC's switchboard was flooded with calls. Not complaints, not confusion, gratitude. People called to say thank you. People called to share their own stories. People called to say they knew an Eleanor. People called to say they were an Eleanor. The network didn't know how to categorize it. There was no precedent. A talk show host doesn't usually break format to honor a dying stranger. It wasn't promotional, it wasn't sponsored, it was just human. Patty Henley's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. It was her supervisor at the hospice. "Did you watch the show last night?" Patty had been working. She missed it. "You need to come in," her supervisor said. "Now." Patty drove to the hospice. She walked into Eleanor's room. Eleanor was awake. Her eyes were open, clear. One of her daughters was sitting beside the bed, crying. Not grief crying. Something else. The daughter looked at Patty and said, "She heard him. She heard him say her name." Eleanor had watched the show. At 11:30 p.m., just like always, she opened her eyes. She watched the monologue. She watched the guests. And at the end, when Johnny said her name, she smiled. Her daughter said Eleanor whispered, "He knew." 2 hours later, Eleanor Hartman passed away. Peacefully, quietly, with Johnny Carson's voice still in the room. The story didn't become national news. It wasn't covered by the major papers. There was no follow-up segment. Johnny never mentioned it again on air, but it spread. Patty Henley kept a copy of the letter she sent. Years later, she shared it with a local reporter in Cleveland. The reporter wrote a small piece about Eleanor, about the nurse who tried, about the moment Johnny stopped being a host and became a human being. That piece got picked up by a few other papers. Not many, just enough. People who worked on The Tonight Show during those years, writers, producers, crew members, they remember that night. Some of them didn't even see it live. They heard about it the next day. But they remember. One producer said, "That was the night I realized why people loved him. It wasn't the jokes. It wasn't the timing. It was that he understood what the show actually was. It was company, and sometimes company means showing up for people you'll never meet." Ed McMahon was asked about it years later in an interview. He said Johnny didn't do it for the show. He didn't do it for the ratings. He did it because it was the right thing to do. That's who he was when the cameras were off, too. Doc Severinsen said, "I've been in show business my whole life. I've seen every kind of moment you can imagine. That one, that's the one I think about." There's a bigger context here that matters. In 1977, television was changing. The industry was becoming more corporate, more calculated. Shows were being focus grouped, hosts were being managed. Everything was about demographics and advertising revenue and keeping sponsors happy. Johnny Carson was the last of a generation that remembered when television was newer, when it was still figuring out what it could be, when a host could make a choice in real time and the whole country would just see it happen. Johnny came from radio. He came from live performance. He came from a world where you didn't get second takes, you didn't get editing, you made a choice, and you lived with it. And that's what he did that night. He made a choice. He could have read Patty's letter and done nothing. He could have sent a nice note back. He could have had a producer call the hospice. He could have mentioned Eleanor in a pre-written segment with jokes and applause. But he didn't. He stopped the machine. He looked at the camera. He said her name. And in doing so, he reminded 30 million people that television, at its best, isn't about entertainment. It's about connection. After Eleanor passed, her family received letters, dozens of them, from people who watched that night, from people who knew what it meant. One letter came from a woman in Oregon who had lost her husband in Vietnam. She wrote, "I watched Johnny every night too. Now I know why." Another came from a man in Florida who worked as a janitor. He wrote, "I always thought nobody saw us. Thank you for seeing Eleanor." A woman in Texas wrote, "My mother is in hospice now. I played the recording for her. She cried. So did I." The letters kept coming for months. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, kept them all in a box. She said later, "My mother spent her whole life being invisible. And then, for one moment, Johnny Carson made sure the whole country knew her name." There's a lesson here, but it's not the kind you can summarize neatly. It's not about fame. It's not about using your platform for good, though that's part of it. It's about recognizing that the people watching aren't just an audience. They're Eleanor. They're the house cleaner who takes the bus home at 9 p.m. and sits down in front of the television because it's the 1 hour she doesn't feel alone. They're the widower who lost his wife 40 years ago and never remarried because some people only get one love. They're the night shift nurse who sees people die and still believes in small mercies. They're the adult child sitting beside a hospice bed, holding their mother's hand, hoping she can hear one last kind word before she goes. Johnny understood that. He understood that late-night television wasn't just jokes and celebrity interviews. It was a ritual, a presence, a voice in the dark that said, "You're not alone." And when given the chance to honor that, to acknowledge one person in a way that mattered, he did it. No fanfare, no applause, just a name. Eleanor. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. He gave his final monologue. He thanked the audience. He walked off stage. He rarely gave interviews after that. He lived quietly. He didn't do the talk show circuit. He didn't write a memoir. But people who knew him, people who worked with him, people who were close to him, they all say the same thing. Johnny wasn't the person you saw on television. He was funnier, yes. He was sharper, yes. But he was also more private, more guarded, more complicated. But every now and then, the real Johnny would come through. The night he said Eleanor's name, that was the real Johnny. In 2005, Johnny Carson passed away. He was 79 years old. The tributes poured in. Presidents, comedians, actors. Everyone who had ever been touched by his work spoke about what he meant to them. But one of the tributes that stood out came from a nurse in Cleveland. Patty Henley, now retired, was interviewed by a local news station. They asked her what she remembered most about Johnny Carson. She said he didn't have to do what he did. Nobody would have known if he hadn't. But he did it anyway. He said her name, and for Eleanor, that was everything. She paused, then added, "That's the measure of a person. Not what they do when people are watching, but what they do when it would be easier to do nothing." There's a recording of that night. March 15th, 1977. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It's available online now, though it wasn't widely circulated for years. NBC kept it in the archives. Fans traded VHS tapes. Eventually, someone digitized it. If you watch it, you'll see what everyone saw that night. Johnny at the desk, the letter in his hand, the camera on his face. And if you listen closely, if you really listen, you can hear the silence in the studio. That's the sound of a room full of people realizing they're watching something that matters. Not a joke, not a bit, a moment, a man saying a name, a dying woman hearing it, and 30 million people understanding all at once why they let Johnny Carson into their homes every single night. Because he stayed. Just like Eleanor said, he stayed.